I'm back. Mr. Clarke's back. Time to take a look at 14.4 as World War II breaks out now in full effect on two war fronts. In fact, it's fighting on multiple war fronts beyond just two. But the two major ones we'll be looking at today will be the Western Front, the Eastern Front, and a little less on the Pacific Front, but we will also touch on the front in North Africa. All right, so we look at the reason for the Allies' European first strategy. That'll be one of the key things we'll look at today. We'll look at some of the turning point battles that took place during World War II, including the battles of Stalingrad and Midway. Discuss how the Allies put increasing pressure on the Axis in Northern Africa, as well as throughout all of Europe. Remember, as we go through this, you should be filling out your focus questions, doing the best you can to respond out to each question so that you can record the most pertinent information. You don't always have to write word for word what I have down, but it's kind of a good idea to get down the key ideas. So we look here at the goals of the Allied and Axis powers. How are these goals similar and different? So each Axis powers had its own goals. So when you look at Germany and Italy and the Japanese, they all want to increase their power and territory, but the way in which they want to achieve it was a little bit different. The Allies were unified in their desire to defeat the Axis powers. So the Allies' goal is to stop the Axis powers. The Axis powers' idea is to defeat the Allies and take what they want. So kind of a different strategy or goal there. They decided to pursue a Europe first strategy and believed Germany was the most urgent threat to take on. As we're going to see, Joseph Stalin becomes a reluctant ally of the Western Allies. He believed that in the end, the Western nations wanted to destroy communism. So always in the back of his mind, Stalin kind of had this idea that eventually this is not going to work out. And eventually he's going to turn out to be correct. 3, what was the first major blow that the United States struck against the Axis powers? First thing the United States did is it became the arsenal of democracy. By arsenal of democracy, we mean the United States is going to use its industrial might to help produce millions of tons of guns, tanks, and other weapons. The United States produced enough to keep the Soviet Union and the British battling the Germans for years to come. Part of the reason why we're able to be the arsenal for democracy is because very early on, as we had looked at previously, Franklin Roosevelt, the President of the United States, had helped to convert over kind of that butter to guns idea, moving our economy away from producing domestically needed items and producing needed items for the war effort. 4, why did the United States struggle to get supplies to the Allies in Europe? Well, the German Navy was always a very difficult task for the United States. The German U-boats were sinking Allied cargo ships at a very alarming rate. Now remember that we think about U-boats as submarines in the United States, or U-boat as an underwater boat for the Germans, or U-boat. What they did too is they numbered each of their submarines. So the first one they made was U1, and then you can see the imagery there on the screen, U505, 505, 505. That is the 505th U-boat that was produced by the German military. 3,500 merchant ships were sunk. Let that sink in for a second. 3,500 ships that were sunk. Thousands of Allied seamen were killed. The reason why the Germans were so successful is the element of surprise. The U-boats were lurking at all different intervals all over the place, all throughout the Atlantic, North Sea, just waiting for an Allied ship to come into their range. So eventually the United States and the Allies had to come up with a strategy to overcome the U-boats. If they were unable to do anything about the U-boats, then it would be very difficult for the United States' advantage of producing weapons and supplies for the war to really help out in the war effort. So the strategy they came up with, and I have an image there for you, it's called the convoy system. The convoy system is when ships traveled in groups and were escorted by Navy ships. The Allies began to use radar, sonar, depth charges, and then bombs to destroy German submarines both above and below the surface. German U-boats, once this strategy was implemented, were destroyed more quickly than the Germans could replace them. So if you look at this image here, you can see all the different ships. And even think about a convoy in general. The biggest advantage a German submarine or U-boat would have is the element of surprise. So let's say it's lurking here and sinks this ship here. Well, all of a sudden its location is now exposed, and all these other ships would have the opportunity to counteract and attack that German submarine or U-boat. So this turned out to be a very effective strategy for the Allies, which helped them to turn around the movement of supplies across the Atlantic. Next, we're going to figure out why Hitler double-crossed Joseph Stalin and attempted to do a blitzkrieg in the Eastern Front in the Soviet Union. If you look at the map here, the purple arrows are the movement of the Axis powers eventually into the Soviet Union. Hitler knew that his military would eventually run out of oil. And to Hitler, that wasn't very slick. So Hitler put together a secret operation, initially codename Operation Barbarossa. He ordered his forces to crush the Soviet Union in a quick campaign. He hoped his blitzkrieg would prove successful and avoid a prolonged campaign that would drag into the Russian winter. So if he can get his hands on the Caucasus oil fields, which are located in this region here. You think about, too, the southernmost area of the Soviet Union basically is in the Middle East, and a lot of that area is oil-rich region. So the Germans could get their hands on those areas. That could be very profitable for them in regard to getting their hands on the oil. Eventually, things are to kind of break down here at Stalingrad, located right there. So Stalingrad in the spring of 1942, the Germans launched a surprise attack on the Soviet oil fields near the city of Stalingrad in south-central Russia. The city was laid in ruins. The Russians fought basically hand-to-hand amidst the ruins to protect the city. In November 1942, the Red Army struck back with everything they had. The battle dragged into the harsh Soviet winter. And on February 2nd, 1943, the last of the German troops surrendered in what is remembered as a major turning point in the Eastern Front. The Soviet Union lost 400,000 Soviet troops in the battle. Think about that for a second. 400,000 troops. 400,000 troops. So when you think about that sheer sacrifice of the Soviet troops, they most certainly did everything they could to hold back the Germans. One of the good things for us as an ally is the Soviet work against the Germans here allowed for the Americans to get better mobilized for the war effort and begin to move into North Africa and eventually into the Western Front. You have to remember each of the turning points. That's why I bolded it out here. So Eastern Front turning point is the Soviet Union's victory at Stalingrad, basically a war of attrition or a battle of attrition. Where eventually the winter set in and the Germans could not be resupplied, and as a result they had to retreat, ultimately in defeat, and Hitler had been beat. And it wasn't a treat. Americans might have thought it was meat. And if there was some heat, the Germans might have been able to hold off the Soviet troops, but because they were starving and freezing to death, they had to get out of Stalingrad. Before the Battle of Stalingrad, the Axis powers continued to steadily advance. They had controlled most of all of Europe. After the Battle of Stalingrad, the Soviet Union went on the offensive effort. So basically, the Soviets began pushing from the east, moving west, where previous to that point in time, at the turning point in Stalingrad, the Soviet Union had been pushed back and the Germans were pushing west from the east, if you can follow. 9, how did access to the oil fields play an important role in World War II? Both sides needed access to oil in order to keep their tanks and ships and planes running. Losing the Battle of Stalingrad meant that Hitler lost access to the oil fields in the Caucasus region, which would allow them to keep fighting more effectively. Also, fighting in the North African front was a battle over the oil fields there in the Middle East as well. And we're going to see how that turns out next. Move into North Africa. The major battle in North Africa is the Battle of El Alamein. The British were under the command of General Bernard Montgomery. He had been fighting both the Italians and then later on the Germans in North Africa for some time. Montgomery was matched up against the great German general Erwin Rommel. In fact, it was the fighting in the deserts here in the region of North Africa, the Sahara Desert, where General Erwin Rommel picked up his nickname. I'll give you a second and see if you can guess the nickname. All right, so those who thought in their head that the nickname of General Erwin Rommel was the Desert Fox, well, that's the response you thought about in your own head. You would be correct. You can see on the screen there, El Alamein, not too far, just a little bit west of Cairo, a major city there in Egypt, not too far from the Nile River, and also along the border there with the Mediterranean Sea. So why did Roosevelt and Churchill decide to take action in North Africa prior to fighting in Europe? The invasion of North Africa required fewer resources than an assault on mainland Europe. Also, too, Churchill realized if they made a big error or mistake in Western Europe, the entire war could be lost. No one loss or victory in North Africa would decide the outcome of the war. So this is almost like a trial run for how the Churchill, Roosevelt, Eisenhower, who's going to command the Allied troops, are going to work collectively together. They also thought this could be a good springboard, moving from North Africa with a victory here, then into southern Italy, and even the island of Sicily. How did the arrival of American generals and military in Morocco impact an attack at Casablanca, which is in Morocco, versus the Germans? Here arrived some great heroes, some great generals in American history and in world history. Generals Dwight David Eisenhower, future president of the United States. Also George Patton, Omar Bradley. They brought much needed leadership to the North African front. The troop reinforcements helped turn around the fighting in North Africa. And this victory at the Battle of El Alamein will be the turning point in North Africa. 240,000, I'm not doing so well with my numbers today, 240,000 Italian and German troops surrendered at El Alamein. The Allies won the first front in the war. The North African front was now closed, and obviously not only a turning point, but it was an end point in regard to fighting in the North African front. Next, Axis powers on the defense. We're going to compare the war in Italy to the war in North Africa. Both the war in North Africa and Italy presented unique challenges to the Allies. The deserts and mountains of North Africa were especially challenging for soldiers. They had to deal with sandstorms, poisonous animals, warfare on the open desert and rugged hills. Italy included steep mountains and narrow unpaved roads, which kind of made the movement of Allied troops kind of difficult. If you've ever traveled to Italy, you'll know that you're on a lot of narrow roads at different points in time. 15, why did Stalin want the Allies to open up a front in France? Stalin wanted another front because of the Soviet Union was enduring heavy losses on the Eastern Front. Opening up another front could potentially draw German forces into a split. If they split their troops, this would give Stalin more of an opportunity to take out the Germans in the Eastern Front. Allies are already fighting in Italy and Northern Africa, while at the same point in time, they began doing nightly bombing raids, coming in and bombing Germany. '16, what were the goals of the Allied bombing runs over Germany? How did that saturation bombing and strategic bombing help fulfill these goals? Well, the Allies wanted to inflict maximum damage on Germany and destroy Germany's ability to wage war. They also wanted to increase the German fear of the Allies. They wanted to create a scenario where the Germans felt that the loss was inevitable. They wanted to start breaking their spirit, their willingness to continue to fight, and slowly but surely they began to do so. 17, who were the Tuskegee Airmen? How did they impact the war? These are heroic African-American pilots. They really proved, almost when you think about the civil rights movement, they're kind of an underreported factor in the civil rights movement when you look at their impact. Certainly very impactful. It proved to the United States and the world that African-American pilots were just as talented as white pilots. They showed tremendous courage and skill. Next, we're going to look a little bit at the war in the Pacific. To be more Pacific, the Battle of Midway. So first of all, on the map, here's the United States, continental United States. You hear Hawaii, and then Midway Island is located here, roughly halfway between Asia and North America, hence the name Midway Island. Much like I had mentioned previously with the battle at Dunkirk, the miracle there, there's a pretty good motion picture that came out on the Battle of Midway. In fact, I recommend the Battle of Midway, or Midway is the name of the film, over the Miracle at Dunkirk film, or Dunkirk. So if you had to watch one or two films, I'd recommend Midway over Dunkirk, but both films are excellent for those who enjoy history and also major motion pictures. So here in the Battle of Midway, Admiral Chester Nimitz got word of an attack, and the Midway film really does a nice job of putting forth some of these ideas. In fact, you would probably understand this battle quite a bit better if you were to watch that film. So a team of code breakers, they're working feverishly to kind of break the Japanese codes. The code breakers reinforced the idea that the attack was imminent here at Midway, so we're able to reinforce Midway with planes and aircraft carriers. The first day of fighting, the Japanese got a little bit better of the United States forces during the early days fighting. Japanese aircraft carriers were attempting to adjust to the unexpectedly strong American forces. They began changing bombs and armaments for the planes. They were hit by American bombs. 3 giant Japanese aircraft carriers were destroyed initially. A 4th was wounded or damaged and finished up the next day. 1/3 of all Japanese warplanes were destroyed. 3,000 Japanese lost their lives. And the Battle of Midway is clearly remembered as the turning point in the Pacific. Photograph you can see here, the American aircraft carrier USS Enterprise on the left. Under Japanese attack at the Battle of Midway, explosions from the bombs that are bursting in mid-air can be seen in the photo. Okay, let's move on to 19. I'm just tightening up the text here so you can see more of it as I move forward in case you missed anything. All right, so 19, what impact would a Japanese victory at Midway have on the war in the Pacific? A Japanese victory at Midway would have forced American defenses back to California, leaving much of the Pacific under Japanese control. So effectively, the Japanese might have controlled the Pacific by now had the United States not won the Battle of Midway. It would make it also difficult for us to defend Hawaii. One of the battles that took place during this period of time is at Guadalcanal. Guadalcanal is a very hot, dense, damp jungle island. It was unpleasant and unfamiliar terrain for those fighting there, made it very difficult. Because many of the other Japanese-controlled islands were similar in nature with hot, damp jungle conditions, it made it very difficult for the United States to secure some of these islands. We did win at Guadalcanal. This gave the United States additional confidence. It allowed for us, too, to move a little bit closer to mainland Japan. They also wanted to force the Japanese to fight in multiple areas in the Pacific, so this really split the Japanese forces further as well. And then the lesson reflection based on what we've learned so far. Why do you think the United States would go on to win the war? So if you think about the United States victory in the war, we had a huge advantage in terms of the ability to produce weapons for the war. And additionally, winning the North African front and successful victories in the Pacific showed the United States was moving in the right direction, making progress, and we were gaining additional and more confidence. You can take a moment or two to get down anything you need. And of course, you always have the opportunities when you're viewing a recorded lesson is to pause wherever you need to kind of get responses down. Hopefully you're getting a good understanding of the ongoing fighting in World War II. And then next time around, we'll look at additional fighting both in the Pacific and also begin looking at some of the ongoing fighting in the Western Front. Until next time, Mr. Clarke is